Golden sunlight poured through the large windows of the small apartment, casting soft shadows on the wooden kitchen table. The young nurse, with braided hair and a smile that could light up the world, filled her coffee mug. Soft music played from the radio, and she hummed along as she slipped on her comfortable nursing shoes and packed her small bag for her shift. Today felt special. Night shifts at the hospital were always challenging, but she loved her job. Helping others, even in tough moments, gave her energy. She thought about how tonight, with coworkers who felt like family, they'd get through the long night with laughter, teamwork, and maybe a few cups of warm tea. Before heading to the hospital, she planned to meet a friend at a cozy cafe downtown. She grabbed her backpack, threw a light jacket over her shoulders, and stepped out with a spring in her step. The morning air was cool, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street filled the air. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and she took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of being alive. The city streets were quiet, with only a few people rushing to work and the sound of sparrows chirping from the trees. She thought to herself that this morning calm was the perfect way to start a long day. At the cafe, her friend was already seated by the window and smiled when she arrived. The cafe was full of colorful flowers, wooden tables, and ceramic mugs with unique designs, and the smell of fresh coffee and homemade pastries filled the air. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting soft shadows on the brick walls. The quiet laughter and murmurs of other customers made the place warm and inviting. "I think I've had enough coffee, or I'll be up all night," she said with a laugh, raising her mug. Her friend squinted and said, "Don't you always work night shifts? Don't you ever get tired?" Tired? When someone needs you in their worst moment, you forget about being tired. Plus, tonight I'm with some great coworkers. We're like a superhero team," she said excitedly, her smile growing as she imagined their laughter at the nursing station. Her friend, curious, asked, "By the way, I heard the old hospital wing is kind of weird. Have you heard any spooky stories?" She shrugged and said, "Yeah, coworkers tell stories sometimes. Doors opening and closing on their own, strange sounds with no source. One even said they saw a shadow following them in the hallway. But I don't believe it. It's probably just exhaustion, making people imagine things." They both laughed, but deep down, a spark of curiosity flickered in her mind. Her friend, with a mischievous grin, said, "If you see a ghost tonight, take a selfie with it. Promise." She laughed and said, "I promise if I see a ghost, I'll call you first and go live on Instagram." They talked for hours about funny memories and weekend plans. She shared stories from her shifts about patients whose small smiles made her day and coworkers who stood by her in tough times. Her friend asked, "How do you have so much energy?" "If I were you, I'd just sleep after a night shift." She replied, "I don't know. Maybe because I feel like my work matters. When a patient looks at you and says, 'Thank you for being here,' it's like you own the world." Her friend nodded and said, "You were born for this job." As the sun began to set, she said goodbye and headed to the hospital. The sunset painted the sky orange and pink with scattered clouds like a painting. She told herself she'd start her shift with energy. But a strange feeling, like an invisible shadow, settled in her heart. She brushed it off, thinking, it's probably just because it's a long night. But deep inside, something warned her this night would be unlike any other. Entering the hospital was old, with white walls that were cracked in places and long hallways that seemed to hold countless stories. The old wing, where she was working tonight, was rarely used. Most patients stayed in the new wing, but sometimes special cases, like those needing quarantine, were sent here. The empty hallways and heavy silence of the night always gave her a strange feeling, not fear, but a curiosity she couldn't explain. The walls of the old wing were full of memories, old framed photos of nurses and doctors from decades past, faded signs listing hospital rules. Even the smell of disinfectant here felt older, like the scent of ancient books. She put on her nursing uniform, tied her hair back, and headed to the nursing station. Her 2 co-workers were already there, an experienced nurse with gray hair, admired for her calm in crises, and a younger nurse, still nervous about night shifts. The experienced nurse smiled warmly and said, "We've got 3 patients tonight, 1 in room 12, 1 in 15, and 1 in 20. The other rooms are empty. Just be careful. This wing gets weird at night." The younger nurse, with a nervous laugh, said, "Weird? Like ghosts?" The experienced nurse shrugged and said, "You'll see. Just don't wander the hallways too much. This wing, it's like it remembers things." She laughed and said, "Remembers? Now the hospital wing has a memory?" But the experienced nurse's look suggested there was more to it, something she didn't want to say aloud, maybe out of fear of being laughed at or because she wasn't sure herself. They divided tasks. She was in charge of checking monitors and giving medications. The younger nurse handled the patient in room 20, and the experienced nurse would organize files and help if needed. Before starting, the experienced nurse pulled a small flask of tea from her bag and poured a cup for each of them. "It's going to be a long night," she said. "We'll need some energy." She took the cup and said, "Thanks. This tea might just get us through till morning." The younger nurse laughed and said, "I just hope the patients are calm tonight. Last time, one woke up at midnight and started singing, probably the meds." They all laughed, and the experienced nurse said, "If we hear singing tonight, we should record it. We'll laugh about it later," she added, "or maybe we'll start singing ourselves, form a nighttime choir." Their laughter echoed in the nursing station, breaking the heavy silence of the old wing for a moment. The experienced nurse added, "By the way, if you hear something in the hallways, don't follow it. This wing, it plays tricks." She asked, curious. "Tricks? What do you mean?" The experienced nurse paused and said, "It's hard to explain. Sometimes you feel like someone's calling you, but when you look, no one's there. Or you see things that disappear. After 20 years here, I'm used to it." The younger nurse, eyes wide, said, "That's creepy. Why didn't they tell us before we took night shifts?" The experienced nurse chuckled and said, "Because if they did, no one would work nights." Past 11 p.m., everything seemed calm. She was reviewing files, the younger nurse was organizing notes, and the experienced nurse was checking medications. But there was something in the air, a heavy feeling she couldn't explain. The old fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the walls. She told herself, it's probably just tiredness, but her heart started beating faster. First signs. At 1:30 a.m., she was reviewing notes at the nursing station when she heard a sound. It was like something heavy being dragged across the hallway floor, a scraping noise, sometimes loud, sometimes faint. She looked up at the dark hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, like metal scratching tiles. "Did you hear that?" she asked the younger nurse who was writing a report nearby. The younger nurse shook her head and said, "What?" "I didn't hear anything. Maybe a rat." "A rat? In this hospital?" she said with a laugh, but her heart raced. The sound came again, louder, from the end of the hallway. She stood and walked toward it. The experienced nurse, reading a file, looked up and said, "Where are you going?" "I just want to check. I heard something like dragging," she said. "Don't go alone. This wing, it's strange at night," the experienced nurse said, hesitantly, lowering her reading glasses. She paused and added, "A few years ago, a nurse heard a similar sound. She didn't find anything, but she felt off all night. Said something was following her." She shrugged and said, "Don't worry, I'll be quick. Probably something fell." But deep down, curiosity mixed with a bit of anxiety. She checked rooms 12, 15, and 20. All 3 patients were asleep and everything seemed fine. The monitors beeped softly, and the patient's steady breathing filled the rooms. When she returned to the station, the monitor for the patient in room 15 suddenly turned off. The screen went black, and the beeps stopped. She rushed to the room, the younger nurse following. "What's wrong?" the younger nurse asked, panting. "The monitor shut off. I don't know why," she said, checking the device. When they reached the room, the monitor was back on, and everything looked normal. The patient was sleeping peacefully, breathing steadily. She pressed a few buttons to ensure the device was working. The younger nurse sighed with relief and said, "Maybe a glitch. These machines are ancient, probably from the 80s. "Yeah, maybe," she said, but she felt uneasy. Something about the patient's face, even in sleep, seemed off, as if they were watching her. She told herself, "It's just tiredness. I'm overthinking." Back at the station, the experienced nurse looked at them curiously and asked, "What was it?" "Nothing." The monitor turned off for a second, then came back on, she said, trying to sound calm. The experienced nurse nodded and said, "This wing is full of things like that. A few years ago, a machine did the same thing. The technician found nothing wrong." She smiled and said, "Maybe it's jealous we have tea and it doesn't." The younger nurse laughed, but the experienced nurse only gave a faint smile before returning to her files. The younger nurse said, "Has anyone told you what this wing used to be?" A day shift nurse said it was a psychiatric ward years ago. Maybe that's why it's weird. The experienced nurse looked up and said, "Yeah, I've heard that. But it's just rumors. This place has been storage and quarantine for years. Old walls always have stories." She joked, "Maybe we should write a book, Secrets of the Old Wing. It'd be a bestseller." They all laughed, but the sound came again. This time, it wasn't just scraping, but a soft thud, like something small falling. She said, "What was that?" The experienced nurse said, "Ignore it. Probably old pipes. This building is full of noises." But her eyes suggested she wasn't convinced. At 2 a.m., the hallway lights started flickering, not once or twice, but constantly, like someone was flipping a switch. The younger nurse jumped and said, "What's going on?" She went to the electrical panel at the end of the hallway, but everything looked normal. The fuses were fine, and there were no signs of trouble. When she returned, she heard a faint whisper, like several people talking softly, coming from the end of the wing. It was from an abandoned room, locked for years, said to have been storage or a quarantine room for special patients. "Did you hear that?" she said to her coworkers, turning toward the sound. The experienced nurse looked up and said, "Whispers? No, I didn't hear anything. But if it's from that room, stay away. That place has stories." The younger nurse, with a nervous laugh, said, "What? Ghosts? Are you serious?" The experienced nurse said firmly, "Ghosts? I don't know. But years ago, a nurse saw something in that room and never worked nights again. She said she saw a shadow by the window, even though we're on the 3rd floor. Even the guards say that room's off. I don't believe in this stuff, but better not risk it." Curiosity pulled her. She said, "I'm going to check. Maybe something fell or someone's there. Maybe an electrician came and we didn't know." The younger nurse said, "Don't go alone. I'm coming. I don't want to stay here by myself." The experienced nurse frowned and said, "Don't look for trouble. But if you're going, be quick and careful. I'll stay here and check on the patients." They walked to the abandoned room together. The hallway felt colder than usual, and their footsteps echoed in the silent night. The whispers grew louder, like mumbled words, maybe a prayer or a faint song. But when they reached the door, the sound stopped. She put her hand on the handle and took a deep breath. Surprisingly, the door wasn't locked. With a gentle push, it creaked open. A sharp smell of disinfectant hit them, so strong it stung their eyes. The room was dark, but the faint hallway light spilled inside. In the middle of the room stood an old wheelchair, its wheels rusted and fabric torn. Suddenly, the wheelchair started moving, slowly and silently, as if someone was pushing it. The younger nurse let out a small scream and grabbed her arm. "What? What's that?" the younger nurse said, her voice shaking. "I don't know. Maybe. The wind?" she said, but she didn't believe it. The windows were boarded up, with no way for air to enter. As they stepped back, the door slammed shut behind them with a loud bang. They froze. The younger nurse ran to the door and turned the handle, but it wouldn't open. "It's locked. What do we do?" the younger nurse said, panicking and banging on the door. She tried to stay calm. "Wait, maybe it's stuck." A moment later, they heard a soft click, and the door opened. When they stepped into the hallway, the wheelchair was still. It was as if nothing had happened. The younger nurse was panting and said, "I'm never going back there. That wasn't normal." She nodded and said, "We need to tell the experienced nurse." Back at the station, the experienced nurse looked worried and said, "What happened? Why do you look so pale?" She explained. In the abandoned room, the wheelchair moved on its own. Then the door locked. We didn't imagine it, did we? The experienced nurse was quiet for a moment, as if recalling something. Then she said, "No, you're not crazy. This wing, sometimes it shows things it shouldn't. Years ago, a guard got stuck in that room. He said the door locked and he felt someone watching him. Another time, an electrician said he felt someone breathing in there. But when he shone his flashlight, no one was there. Just try to ignore it." The younger nurse said, "Ignore it? How? This is driving us crazy." The experienced nurse said calmly, "I know it's hard, but if you let it scare you, it gets worse. Stay together and focus on your work." She said, "But what if it's real? What if something wants to hurt us?" The experienced nurse replied, "In 20 years, it's never hurt anyone. It just wants to scare you. Don't let it win." At 2:45 a.m., the phone at the station rang loudly. Still shaken from the abandoned room, she moved toward it. The experienced nurse said, "I'll get it." But when she picked up, there was only static and heavy breathing. "Hello? Who's this?" No answer. A few seconds later, the line went dead. Suddenly, the hallway lights went out. It was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the monitors remaining. The younger nurse said, "What's happening?" A few seconds later, the lights came back on. But something caught her eye. The quarantine room, always locked with a key held only by the head nurse, was now ajar. The experienced nurse frowned and said, "That door shouldn't be open. It's never open. The key's in the head nurse's office." The younger nurse said, "We need to call the guard. This isn't normal. Maybe someone's in the hospital who shouldn't be." The experienced nurse hesitated and said, "The guard? They'll think we're joking. But fine, call them. Better than us chasing trouble." She called the internal phone and spoke to the guard. "Hi, we're in the old wing. Things are weird. The quarantine room door's open. Lights are flickering. Can you come check?" The guard, a middle-aged man with a sleepy voice, said, "What? The door's open." "Okay, I'm coming. But it's probably nothing. This wing's old. It's always got stories." 10 minutes later, the guard arrived with a large flashlight. She, the experienced nurse, and the younger nurse explained what they'd seen. The guard walked to the quarantine room, but when he got there, the door was locked. He looked at them, confused, and said, "It's locked. Are you sure it was open?" The younger nurse, frustrated, said, "We all saw it. It was half open. We even heard whispers." The guard shrugged and said, "Maybe you're tired. This wing messes with you at night. I'll check the hallways and be back." He walked the halls, but found nothing. When he returned, he said, "Everything's fine. Call if anything else happens." Then he left. When he was gone, the experienced nurse said, "See? I told you no one believes us. These things only happen to those who are working in this wing." She said, frustrated, "But we're not crazy. Something's here." The younger nurse said, "Maybe we should tell the head nurse." The experienced nurse shook her head. "It's 3 a.m. The head nurse won't come till morning. We have to handle this ourselves." She said, "But what if it keeps happening? There's only 3 of us." The experienced nurse said, "That's why we stay together. If we split up, it'll be worse. This wing feeds on our fear." The younger nurse, tears in her eyes, said, "I can't think about this. I just want this night to end." She put a hand on the younger nurse's shoulder and said, "I get it, but we're stronger than this. We'll make it till morning." At 3 a.m., they heard slow footsteps from the empty hallway, but no one was there. Suddenly, all the monitors started beeping for no reason. She ran to room 12. The younger nurse followed. When they arrived, the bed was empty. Where was the patient? On the wall, a long, distorted shadow moved, as if it didn't belong to anyone. "What? What is that?" the younger nurse said, staring at the wall. She said, "I don't know." "Go get the experienced nurse." The younger nurse ran and brought her back. When they reached the room, the patient was in bed as if they'd never left. The experienced nurse said quietly, "This wing is playing with us. It wants to scare us." She asked, "But why? Why are we the only ones seeing this?" The experienced nurse said, "I don't know. Maybe because we're here at this hour, in this silence. This wing, it's like it's alive, like something's trapped here, something that can't leave." The younger nurse said, "That's terrifying. I can't think about this." The experienced nurse put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Don't be scared. We're together. Focus on our work." At that moment, the elevator started moving on its own, going up and down, as if someone was pressing the buttons. The experienced nurse said, "This is too much. We need to call the guard again." She said, "It's no use. He didn't see anything last time." The younger nurse pleaded, "But we have to try. Maybe this time he'll find something." They called the guard again, but the phone only gave a busy signal. The experienced nurse, worried, said, "Either he's asleep or I don't want to think about it." The younger nurse said, "Maybe we should go downstairs and check the guard post." She said, "No, that's risky. We can't leave the patients. We have to stay and keep watch." They went to the surgical wing, where they'd heard coughing. When they entered, a tray of surgical tools was scattered on the floor, as if someone had knocked it over on purpose. She felt an icy hand touch her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The younger nurse, terrified, said, "You felt it too, right?" "I felt something behind me." The experienced nurse said, "Stay calm. We're together. Nothing can hurt us. We just need to last till morning." At 3:15 a.m., a tapping sound came from the third-floor window, like someone knocking. But outside was only darkness. She approached the window but saw nothing. Suddenly, a drawer in the patient's room opened on its own, and she felt a cold breath on her neck. The experienced nurse said, "Get away from the window. Now's not the time to be curious." She stepped back hesitantly and said, "This is getting worse. We need to do something." The experienced nurse said, "The only thing we can do is stay together and not let this stop us from our work. The patients need us." The younger nurse said, "But I can't focus. It feels like something's following us." She said, "I know it's scary, but if we let fear win, we can't do our job. Let's talk about something else to distract ourselves." They spent a few minutes talking about normal things, like favorite foods or recent movies. The experienced nurse said, "Once, during a day shift, a patient brought us homemade cake. I still remember the taste. We could use something like that tonight." The younger nurse, with a weak laugh, said, "Yeah, cake would be better than these shadows." For a moment, things felt normal, but the calm didn't last. At 4 a.m., they heard faint crying from an empty room. She said, "What's that?" The experienced nurse said, "We'll go together. No one goes anywhere alone anymore." They walked to the room. When they opened the door, an old cloth doll with button eyes and a stitched smile sat on the bed. The younger nurse said, "What's this doing here?" "I'm sure it wasn't here before." She picked up the doll. It was cold, like it had been in a freezer. Suddenly, The door slammed shut behind them, and the light went out. It was pitch black. The younger nurse screamed. The experienced nurse said firmly, "Stay calm." Open the door. She turned the handle, but it was locked. The crying grew louder, as if coming from the doll. The experienced nurse said, "Drop the doll." Now. She threw it to the floor, and moments later, they heard a soft click. The door opened. When they stepped into the hallway, the experienced nurse said, "This wing is alive. Something here doesn't want us here. It's testing us." The younger nurse, crying, said, "I can't do this anymore. I want to go home." She put a hand on her shoulder and said, "I know, but it's just one more hour. We'll get through it together." "I promise," the experienced nurse said. "She's right. We're stronger than this. We just need to stick together." At 4:30 a.m., as they sat at the nursing station, trying to calm themselves with a small talk, they heard another sound. It was like nails scratching the hallway wall, sharp and grating. The younger nurse said, "Enough. Someone needs to help us." The experienced nurse said, "The guard was useless. But maybe we can call the new wing. Maybe a night shift nurse there can come." She called the internal phone and spoke to a nurse in the new wing. "Hi, we're in the old wing. Things are weird. Can you send someone to help?" The new wing nurse, surprised, said, "Weird? What's going on?" She explained, "Doors are opening and closing. We hear sounds. We even found a doll on a bed." The guard came, but he saw nothing. The new wing nurse paused and said, "Are you joking? Okay, I'll ask someone to come. But we're busy here, so it might take a while." Half an hour passed, but no one came. The experienced nurse said, "I figured. They think we're pranking them." She said, "Maybe we should go to the new wing ourselves." The experienced nurse said firmly, "No, we can't leave the patients. If something happens, it's on us. We wait till morning." The younger nurse said, "But I feel like it's getting closer, like it's watching us." She said, "I know it's scary, but we're 3 strong. Nothing can break us." To lighten the mood, the experienced nurse suggested, "Let's play a game. Each of us tells a funny story from our past shifts." The younger nurse, doubtful, said, "A game? Now?" The experienced nurse said, "It's the best time. It'll distract us from the fear." She started. Once, during a day shift, a patient thought I was a doctor and asked for advice. I finally said, "I'm just a nurse." And he said, "Well, you're better than the doctors." They all laughed, and for a moment, the fear faded. The experienced nurse said, "I once went to the storage room for syringes. It was dark, and I bumped into a broom. I thought it was a person and talked to it for a few seconds." The younger nurse said, "Last week, I was so sleepy, I tried to give a shot to a pillow instead of the patient." Their laughter filled the station, but the scratching sound returned, louder. They fell silent and looked at the hallway. Something moved in the shadows, but when she shone her flashlight, nothing was there. At 5 a.m., the faint light of sunrise peeked through the hallway windows, easing the heavy atmosphere. The 3 of them, exhausted and shaken, sat at the nursing station. The experienced nurse said, "Not much longer now. Just a bit more." She said, "This was the longest shift of my life." The younger nurse, with a weak smile, said, "But at least we were together. If I was alone, I'd have fainted by now." The experienced nurse said, "Whatever this wing is, it can't tear us apart. We're a team." When the morning shift nurse, a middle-aged woman with a calm smile, arrived, she quickly gathered her things. The experienced nurse told the morning nurse, "Last night, we saw things. We called the guard, the new wing, but no one helped." The morning nurse laughed and said, "You fell for this wing's stories? It's old. It makes you imagine things." She said firmly, "It's not stories. It was real. All 3 of us saw it." The experienced nurse said, "No one will believe us, but we know what we saw." The younger nurse, still pale, said, "I'm never working nights again, ever." She never took another night shift, but whenever she thought of the hospital, She felt something waiting in those old hallways. Something only she and her co-workers had seen. Something no guard or other nurse could help with or believe. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she heard the whispers, slow footsteps, and the faint cry of the doll in her mind, as if part of that night stayed with her forever. But it wasn't just fear she carried from that night. It was the bond with her co-workers who stood by her, even when no one else believed them. She sometimes thought of that night and told herself, we were stronger than the shadows.